This is the developer track. Hopefully everyone here knows Node.js. This is a talk for Node.js developers. I'm Carlos Santana. I work for IBM. I'm a senior principal engineer, cloud architect, and I also work on open source with a project called Knative, and you'll be seeing a little bit of that today. So this talk is about for Node.js developers that they're getting started with Kubernetes or containers to make their applications cloud enabled. And the slides are available in this. The first thing people ask, like, where are the slides? You want to take a picture, that's the QR code to the slides. And also, if you have your laptop or your phone, it's easier to read them locally because this screen is kind of small for people that are way on the back. The intro is you as a Node.js developer, you are very familiar as a Node.js. Probably you have a Node.js sticker in your laptop, like I do. But today we're going to see if we can get you to the next level, maybe, of cloud, getting your applications on the cloud with Kubernetes and a Kubernetes plugin that I work on as a maintainer for open source called Knative. So this is the table of content that we're going to work today is 4 things. This is a very short talk. So we're going to concentrate on containers, Kubernetes, user experience for developers, not necessarily for your end users, and then observability, which is the last piece of the day 2 or operations that developers get involved, and sometimes they even get involved as part of PagerDuty or being on call. Some people call them containers. So the cloud, when you talk about cloud native, or if you're in an organization, if you're university, or you're in a corporate environment, when they talk about cloud native, these days what it means is containerizing your applications based of a packaging format, that then that application is portable across clouds. And clouds can be something on premise also. I work with clients that they run bare metal servers, virtual machine servers on premises, and they call that their cloud, where they seal the network and also they're close to the data. For containers, usually there's a recipe file called the Docker file that you as a Node.js developer, if you're in an organization that you have DevOps, and this is why DevOps, there's many talks about DevOps, having a DevOps person, at least one person in the group or the team to help all the developers out to, like, they don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. This is a typical Docker file that they will be creating for Node.js. And what I see out there is sometimes tutorials or documentation, even from cloud providers. Like this morning, I saw a cloud provider putting an example of a Docker file, and it was not optimized for Node.js. It worked for Node.js, but it wasn't optimized. So Docker, actually the Docker documentation has a very good section that says best practices for writing Docker files. But the idea of this talk is to put this kind of like invisible file in your repository, that you do it once, or somebody from DevOps do it for you and helps you out. So these are some of the tips if you have people in DevOps that are working with Docker files. One is, recommendation is, do not have 2 Docker files, one for dev, one for production. Use an argument. An argument is something that you can pass to the build process, and then within the Docker file, you can have the same Docker file be used for development or production. That's something that people don't tend to do, but I found it as a best practice. Another one is, I see people doing in Docker files, copy everything or their package.json and all these JavaScript files to the container and then doing an npm install. I say, use this pattern where you only copy the package.json or the package log file and then run npm install if you are doing development, but run npm CI. There's equivalents for Yarn, right? You're familiar with Yarn. And that will create a layer in the Docker file that then is stamped and then it's cached. So then the next step that you would do is copy the rest of the files, your actually JavaScript files, and run them as non-root. sometimes people get in this trap of running Docker containers in their laptops, but they're actually running as root. When they deploy into the cloud or to the enterprise cluster, their application doesn't run, and the only reason is because it's trying to run as root, and that creates a security risk. So there's policies in the clusters that don't allow for that. And there's many tips. I would also have a talk around creating Docker files and best practices, that this is something that you do once. So think about it as a make file. There's not that much work or resumes that says, I'm an expert in make files. This is something that you do, just save it for the team and then forget about it as you work on Node.js. The second one is Kubernetes. So a lot of people ask me like, how do I get started with Kubernetes? And then my answer is usually like, why do you want Kubernetes, right? So maybe you don't want Kubernetes, maybe you don't need Kubernetes. But if you do, probably maybe you are in an environment that you are a Node.js developer, that your applications are deployed to Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is around those containers that we already talked about, orchestrating them between virtual machines or bare metal servers. So this is a very high level of Kubernetes. And I put the Kubernetes because some people don't have to be aware of that. I have executives from other companies call it like the Kubernetes. I was like, it's Kubernetes, not the Kubernetes, but it's kind of funny. So you have containers, right? These boxes represent your containers, and you want to run them in a cluster, and the cluster is basically nodes. And Kubernetes, we call them nodes. Hosts is basically virtual machines or bare metal machines that you rent out, or you just, usually in the cloud. If you have it on premises, you buy them and run them on premises. But basically, it's our computers. It could be NUC machines. It could be Raspberry Pis. I run Kubernetes on Raspberry Pis as a home lab. But these are, when we talk about Kubernetes, those are the nodes. When you tell that to a Node.js developer, we think about Node being something else. Then there's this deployment object programming model that it has a pod spec. And the pod spec is the thing that encapsulates one or more containers into a single IP address space. So when you have a deployment, the deployment says, how many copies of an application do I want? And each one will have an IP address. And that's okay. This is where we go into distributed programming, where you have one Node.js application implementing a REST API, for example. But as you have more users or more traffic, you will need more replicas because you need more CPU, or you need redundancy. So this is where you need multiple pods, and that's the next level of Kubernetes. Anything that runs on a Kubernetes cluster will be around the pod. So any documentation you see out there, it will be around the pod. But those IP addresses need to be surfaced as a group in top of a virtual IP address, and we call that a service. And then that service is usually accessed from the outside the cluster. A lot of services are within the cluster that communicate each other. We call that microservices. But eventually something outside the cluster is going to get access to that service. And this is where we create an ingress. And the ingress is also another terminology used in distributed programming or in Kubernetes. That is how traffic goes into the cluster. And this is where you put your DNS. This is where you configure your DNS, hello.example.com, that translate to an IP address, which is usually a load balancer, but it's an ingress into your cluster. So that's kind of like maybe less a one-on-one of Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a little bit more complex than that, but at least give you the idea of like when you're dealing with your application and you want to run it, what are the kind of the first terminology and how these things work out. And this is something that I teach as the first thing when we go and learn Kubernetes. Then the next thing that you find out in Kubernetes community is people making fun about YAML, like there's so much YAML. And I come from a background of I did data centers, but then I did a lot of mobile development and I did web development. And I'm more like a JSON person. And the joke is kind of like you deal with YAML, but at the end of the day, all these utilities take that YAML, gets converted into JSON, and then it sends that JSON into the Kube API server. So whoever is making fun of me of knowing JSON because I'm not using YAML, at the end of the day, the Kube Kubernetes API takes JSON, doesn't take YAML. But the idea is the net is config management. These systems need to be configured very easily, very static, very declarative. So Kubernetes has taken a lot of the space is because of that nature of being able to declarative state what is the configuration of that cluster of that cloud in YAML files is a way of doing that configuration, but it requires you to define all these resources that I already talked about. Knative is a new project, it's open source project, you can think about it an extension or plugin that you add to Kubernetes, kind of to make it like a abstraction where you write that high level YAML file, and then the controller behind the scenes will create all the Kubernetes things that you do. So you can choose of starting with Kubernetes, and then you can add Knative, and then you can simplify the YAML exposed to the developers, for example, or DevOps people. In this case, you can start with Knative, and then under the hood, it will create the deployment, the service, the ingress, the routing, the traffic, all these YAML files for you in the cluster. But what you care about is I have a Node.js application and I just want to deploy it. And I want to deploy it on a URL, like hello.example.com. So this is actually all the YAML that you would take to configure that. And then an image. So we talk about containers. Containers is the running application. The image is kind of like the files that represent that immutable image or immutable set of files, like a tar or a zip file that is instantiated into a container. So Knative is one of the utilities that we try to bring into Kubernetes ecosystem to make it easier for developers to get started and also run in production in Knative. And one of the capabilities that also people come into Knative is that Kubernetes doesn't offer is scale to zero. If nobody's using your containers, the containers just shut down. And in some cases where you're running on the cloud, you don't get charged. So it scales out based on requests, how many requests, HTTP requests are coming into the cluster, and then containers will start coming up from 0 to 1 to 3, or how many you want, and then when traffic stops, it goes back to 0. So it's kind of the serverless or Lambda or functions aspect of it. Then the next one is user experience. One of the things that I see all the time around the Kubernetes space or cloud native space, even from vendors, is this Docker file or create an image, create a container, run a deployment tool, run a shell script and deploy. But what I think is missing is I started in Node.js. Well, I started like in front-end development and then I moved to Node.js. But I live the instant feedback, the live reload, be able to change one line of JavaScript and instantly see the change. That inner loop that we call in the development experience is something that I cannot let go to, like change my code and then run a Docker command to create an image and a shell script to push it somewhere, and then kubectl to run a YAML file, and then eventually we'll run to see like I made my change. I want something that I had before, even in mobile development. I had this experience of changing one line of code, and since it's JavaScript, is interpreted code. I'm not compiling into native, so it should be fast. I should not lose that just because the fact that I want to run my application in the cloud. So that's kind of my experiment that I did for this talk. So as a Node.js developer, what I want to see is I want to see a template. Go to somebody's GitHub repo, or somebody tells me, or the DevOps team in the company says, here's a GitHub or a Git template. Go fork it. The README should be very simple. npm install if I have Node.js in my computer, maybe I don't have it. And then npm run dev. Don't expose the details of what is the tool of the week, because tools will change depending on which cloud provider you're using, which infrastructure tool you're using, maybe using Terraform, using Ansible, using kubectl, using Pulumi, all these tools. But to the Node.js developer or the developers, they want to be productive writing API or business logic or configuring or talking to APIs. So this is something that I want to keep simple for the Node.js developer. Find a Node.js repo, clone it, and npm run npm run is a typical way of providing like entry points to a Node.js application. So let's see a demo. This is a QR code. This is a running in IBM Code Engine. IBM Code Engine is something that you can just give it a GitHub repo with Python, Node.js, any library that you want, and we will take care of creating that image for you, giving you back a URL that scales to 0. So if nobody visits that URL, it goes to 0. Somebody visits that URL or it hits very hard, it will start processing concurrent requests until it connects to the replica. So for that, I'm going to do the demo also in my local computer, because sometimes I don't want to deploy to the cloud. I just want to like that quick feedback of running the application in my computer. But in my case, I don't have Docker desktop because my company is not going to be paying that fee, at least for now, of allowing me for Docker desktop. So I'm going to use a little VM Linux machine. It comes with Kubernetes called Minikube, and I'm going to install Knative. So for that demo, basically this is the experience that I want to provide to the developers. Just git clone the repo. So on the right or in your left, you will see that I have an index.js, I have a package.json, and that's it. And I have a README. Basically, you get this file, and somebody that knows Node.js basically is looking for the README. The README says run npm run dev, not even npm run install, npm install. So let's do that now. I'm doing this because of I don't want to run my chances with Wi-Fi. So if I run npm run dev, this will build a container. I will build a container behind the scenes. It will start watching my directory for my index.js or whatever JavaScript file that I have. Then I can check if I want to see what's going on in my local computer. I can use Kubernetes, kubectl, get pods, so to see that container that is running, but I don't have to, just me being curious about it. Then I'm using the VS Code simple browser, but you can use any browser. And then I'm going to like refresh, and I should see hello world. So this is this experience that people should have, like going from 0 to running your application in Kubernetes. It should take like seconds, right? Git clone, npm run dev. Already, you have to like install Minikube if you want to run in this locally, but you can also have a Kubernetes somewhere. And then it says hello world. The next thing that I see projects doing, or like cloud providers or tutorials, is missing the debugging. I love the ability to just click in the debug button and be able to do a breakpoint and investigate what's the request coming in into my API, so I can even change it or see like debug my code. So in this case, this repo is already set up. So I have a breakpoint here. I'm changing the code. So this is the example of I'm changing the code to make it bigger, hello world. And then when I hit save, you will see that it takes less than a second to see my change. So there's no like large look for this. And this is where I go to the debug icon. If you don't know about this, some people don't know. VS Code and other IDEs provide the ability to attach a debugger. You can also attach the Chrome DevTools debugger. Are we doing time? And then hit the debugger, and this debugger would attach. It's already attached, and I can like refresh my browser, and it already did the breakpoint. So at this point, I can just do my DevTools in Chrome or in VS Code and inspect the variables here, even change them, right? Hello, A2, all things open 2021, save it, and I can continue with my application, and my application will say that. So this is the experience that as a Node.js developer that you want to have, and you don't want to lose just because the business or the application wants to run on the cloud and you want to deal with containers. You want to keep that user experience to be productive, right? So that's the demo. I don't know if people visited my my URL, but this is how I was able to deploy my applications. Is living on the cloud. And if you want to try it out, it has a free tier in IBM Code. It's called Code Engine. And it's a matter of like create, and then you can provide a container image if you have one, like nginx or anything like that, or provide a source code, right? A GitHub repository. Select how much memory and CPU. In my case, I selected the minimum. Like this Node.js didn't require that much CPU, so I give it like 1/4, 0.125 of CPU, and then 256 megs, and then hit create, and I had my code in Code Engine. And this is the code that is there. And a little bit of smoke and mirrors is that I'm using the VS Code settings.json to hide some of the files. So this repo actually has a Docker file, so I can unhide it, and then you can see the Docker file also has a folder called DevOps. And if you want to see like, because every developer wants to see like, don't like magic. I want the magic experience, but I actually want to see what's going on. This repo has YAML files. I just hide them with the VS Code extension. So you can see here, I have the Kubernetes deployment.yaml that you can do npm run dev, and I have the Knative installations, and I have the service.yaml for Knative. So this is the YAML file, and I have the, if I run npm run, if you're familiar with npm run, I don't know if you can see that. It has the other options that I put there, like npm run kube debug, kube dev, if you want to use Kubernetes and not Knative, npm URL to give me the URL, but npm dev and npm URL is basically the things that you want, and the only things that you need. So if we go back to the slides, that was the demo. The demo is in the slides, so I added them just as a convenience. And then the last thing I want to end, because this was a short presentation, is do not forget about observability. So observability is a matter of monitoring your applications, like logging, tracing, and monitoring or metrics to observe your applications when they're running in production. This is where like people fall down into going to production. They cannot meet those non-functional requirements and their SLOs. IBM and Red Hat work together on something called the Node.js reference architecture. But these are kind of the top things I tell people to start with, like logs, metrics, tracing, and probes. The reference architecture has examples on how you can add logs. For example, if you're doing logs with console.log, that's a bad practice. When you go into production and go to the cloud, the best practice is log to standard output, but standard output with JSON. One line of a JSON string. So that way, things like logDNA, ELK, all these observability tools can parse that JSON. And we have here an example, like we use a library called Pino, and the reference architecture goes of which module do I use for which practice. So it shows you the practice of a best practice for cloud native, and also which npm module do I use. So all the links are at the end. And this is the QR code to the slides, and these are the links. So I want to end there because I think I went over a little bit over time.